But first, major combat operations resumed in Gaza over the weekend after the truce between Israel and Hamas collapsed on Friday. Both sides blamed each other for the end of the pause, which lasted about a week and allowed for the release of 80 Israeli hostages in exchange for 240 Palestinian prisoners. Today, the Israel Defense Forces say they're expanding their ground assault to all corners of Gaza, vowing to pursue Hamas wherever they are.
We have entered a new phase in our war against Hamas. Hamas broke the humanitarian pause when it violated the hostage release agreement. We pursued them in northern Gaza. We're now pursuing Hamas in southern Gaza too.
Vowing to pursue Hamas with maximum force while trying to minimize harm to civilians, the Israeli military is pressing deep into the south of Gaza, saying they are now striking Hamas targets across the entire Gaza Strip. The IDF have expanded their ground assault southward, where witnesses and local journalists have spotted Israeli tanks on the outskirts of Khan Yunis. Heavy airstrikes have been reported in that city and in Rafah further south. The military posting a map of neighborhoods around Khan Yunis, telling the residents to flee, and also dropping leaflets warning them of the operation. Rocket flares and billowing smoke could be seen in the city today as Israel and Hamas fighters exchanged fire. The United Nations said the areas in the south that Israel had ordered evacuated in the 3 days since the truce had housed more than 350,000 people before the war, not counting the hundreds of thousands now sheltering there from other areas. Many of those ordered to flee were already displaced from places in the north, including the people who lived in this house, destroyed in an Israeli airstrike. She says, they told us to move from the north to Khan Yunis, since the south is safer, and now they've bombed Khan Yunis. Even Khan Yunis is not safe now. The UN chief says there's nowhere safe to go in Gaza, but a senior Israeli government advisor rejects that, saying there are designated safe zones for civilians. The U.S. is calling on the IDF to do more to protect civilians, but says it's too early to tell if Israel is following that call.
We do not want to see a military campaign in the south that looks like the north, and what we mean by that, we do not want to see the same level of civilian casualties. We do not want to see the same level of mass displacement.
At least one hospital in Khan Yunis says it's been overwhelmed by casualties from intensive Israeli airstrikes over the weekend. With 80% of Gazans now displaced and the horrific humanitarian situation continuing to spiral, aid organizations are again sounding the alarm.
So the first thing people need is somewhere safe. The second thing they need is somewhere to shelter.
Many of the displaced, if not most, are now crammed into these overcrowded UNRWA schools and other collective centers. The living conditions there are just appalling. These kind of conditions are ripe for the spread of disease. And we're seeing increased numbers of respiratory infections, of diarrhea. We've had over 1,100 cases of jaundice, which would make us concerned about the spread of hepatitis.
For more, we're joined by James Gelvin, a professor of Middle Eastern history at the University of California, Los Angeles. James, is this expanded offensive in the south of Gaza like anything Israel has done before?
Well, if you look at it in the short term, yes, it's an expanded version of what they did in the north already. But overall, no, it's not. Israel has had this policy with Hamas and Hezbollah. It's called cutting the grass, which is in order to make sure that this sort of thing winds down. They are attempting to just eliminate weapon systems and infrastructure and stuff like that. They do this on a fairly regular basis, like every summer or so. And the idea being that they'll eliminate the armaments and the sides will resupply, then they'll eliminate them again, they'll resupply and that sort of stuff. This occupation is something unlike what Israel has done before. It can probably be compared to Israeli occupation of Lebanon, and that took a long time for Israel to get out of Lebanon.
Could Israel wipe out Hamas entirely as it has vowed?
Israel can't wipe out Hamas entirely. That's a silly idea to begin with. I mean, Hamas is an organization that's involved not only in militias, but also involved in administration. It's involved in hospital management. It's involved in education. There are a lot of people who are dependent upon Hamas. Hamas fighters can melt back into the population without any difficulty. There's approximately 25,000 members of Hamas. There's also we don't really know how many people are in the military wing of Hamas, but the estimates are from about 15 to about 40,000. So the idea of eliminating Hamas is something that was spoken before was actually thought about.
Now, what about the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza? Has it ever been this bad during previous wars?
The situation in Gaza is probably worse now than it's ever been. The destruction of not only infrastructure, but particularly public health facilities, the inability of doctors to get to patients, the food, the lack of food in the strip. I mean, all this is taking a severe toll. And we're talking now so far about 15,000 people have been killed. We don't really know how much that's going to escalate in the future. But as soon as the fighting stops, we still have to figure out how to get water to these people, how to get electricity to these people, et cetera. So this is a horrible situation that we're facing.
While the truce broke down, it did hold for a while. What does history tell us about how these two warring sides could eventually come to a ceasefire?
Well, I'm not quite sure how we're going to come to a ceasefire at this point. Israel doesn't want a ceasefire. Hamas probably doesn't want a ceasefire. The negotiations that took place was already a win-win for both sides. Israel got to demonstrate the fact that it takes the hostage situation seriously. The government has been under a lot of pressure from the hostage families. And their two goals, the destruction of Hamas and the release of hostages, are incompatible. You can't do both. You can't destroy Hamas and get the hostages released. For Hamas, what it's done is it's demonstrated the fact that they can play as an equal to Israel. Also, it gets to demonstrate that violence works and that they've been able to get prisoners back, Palestinian prisoners, which has a great deal of resonance with the population, whereas the Palestinian Authority under Fatah, under the PLO, has not been able to do this. And so we have violence on one side that's been successful, and we have negotiations on the other side that has not been successful. So Hamas has won, the Israeli government has also won by the ceasefire.
That's James Gelvin, a professor of Middle Eastern history at the University of California, Los Angeles. James, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.